We are recording. So we are having to be via Zoom, even though Rabbi Hammer is here in Florida physically, all the way from Israel. But I hope in the future we will be able to invite him back to our congregation to have him speak about a variety of different topics that he generally speaks on. Tonight, he is going to be speaking about Israel and engaging the disengaged, which we all can relate to. I'm sure we know somebody in our lives that has become disengaged, and Rabbi Hammer hopefully will give us some insight about how to re-engage. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Rabbi Hammer. So Rabbi Shalom Hammer has lived in Israel now for 31 years and serves as a lecturer in the IDF for both the educational branch and the Jewish identity branch of the Army. He is the founder and director of Makom Mishutaf, which offers non-denominational and non-coercive Jewish educational programming for kibbutzim, moshavim, and pre-military academies throughout Israel, currently under the auspices of Mizrahi Olami, or the World Mizrahi. Rabbi Hammer has authored 5 books, Armed with Spirit by Geffen Publishing being the most recent. He is a sought-after lecturer in Israel and abroad, and we are extremely lucky to have him with us tonight. For those of you who have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, please let them know that the recording will be up on our Temple Shalom YouTube for them to watch it at a later time. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to Rabbi Hammer. He's asked that we will begin with his lecture, and the last 10 minutes I will open up to Q&A. So simply feel free to write your questions in the chat so that you don't forget them, or hold on to them and I will get to everybody to have your questions answered towards the end of the session. Rabbi Hammer, I'm going to turn over to you.
Rabbi Boxman, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed that introduction to the extent that I'll say I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say. But thank you for inviting me here. I thank Rabbi Miller in absentia. I'm not sure if he's there, Rabbi. Please relate that to him. And thank you, Temple Shalom, for inviting me to this Zoom. I have to tell you that in the background, I'm hearing
Rabbi Hammer, we think we lost you.
You want to turn that up?
Florida. Rabbi, I'm still here.
Okay, yep, you froze up for a few seconds there.
Oh, okay. You got me back now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. In any event, I do look forward to meeting all of you and to doing so in person and visiting beautiful Naples. I've been there before, and being able to partake and be part of together with your congregation. Tonight, I'm going to speak about what I call engaging the disengaged. And there's no question that certainly over the past few years, the dynamic with regards to interest and exhibiting in Israel, certainly amongst the younger generation, what we would call the tweens, or that we would call the yuppies of our generation, to a certain extent, it has dissipated and certainly lessened with regards to their interest in Israel, their engagement in Israel, what's going on in Israel, visiting Israel, understanding Israel, and making it a priority within their lives. And what happened? Why is that the state as such? So, of course, when one speaks about any problem for that matter, in order to, so to speak, solve the problem, which I doubt I'll be able to do in this one session this evening over the next 3 hours. I'm just joking. I'm not going to speak for 3 hours. Don't panic. I can't see you anyway, but it's okay. But in the next bit of time that we have, before one even attempts to solve, one has to recognize that a problem exists. And identifying the problem would probably be the very onset, the initial issue, and recognizing it in order to understand it and ultimately address it with proposed solutions. So how do we identify? Where is this, or can we identify this problem? Where is it coming from? The Pew study, PEW, that was conducted in the United States in 2013, they asked the question, many questions, but one of the questions that was relevant to what we're discussing tonight, they asked, that it's an American public, obviously, what does it mean to be Jewish in the United States of America? 73% of those Jews who were polled in that sampling said that they identified Judaism or their Judaism with regards to the Holocaust. 69% of those polled said that they see Judaism as an ethical part of their essential structure. In other words, Judaism, or to be Jewish in the United States, means to behave ethically. And only 43% at some point in that poll expressed any identity with meaning to Judaism with regards to their affiliation to Israel. And if we speak about the primary focus, as much of American Jewry does, on the Holocaust, even that left much to be desired. It was only a number of years ago that I read an article that was shocking to me in the New York Times that demonstrated, in a sampling of New York Jews, we're not talking about Naples, Florida, we're not talking about Wyoming, Montana, we're talking about heartland New. In the New York Times, they found in a sampling of 2,000 young adult Jews with regards to the Holocaust that only 42% of them who were asked what happened in Auschwitz, only 42% of them knew and understood what was going on there. In addition, of those polled, only 38%, or I should say 38% of those polled, were under the presumption that 2 million people died during the Holocaust, as opposed to obviously the 6 million that we know in our fingertips, unfortunately and tragically. And so clearly there is a disconnect within the world at large, including in the Jewish world, with regards to history, with regards to appreciating and understanding our role, our place in history, and with regards to appreciating Israel's place as a country, as a Jewish country, as our country, and identifying as Jews, and Israel's part and parcel of where it exhibits itself within our identity as Jewish people. And the question is why? What has happened that within these polls, such astounding numbers would be exhibited, such lack of understanding and identity? One of the problems, one of the source of the problems, and I'm going to list a number of them. One of the problems is what we call the Rabbanut, the rabbinate of Israel. And certainly, by the way, I myself am Orthodox. I consider myself an Orthodox Jew, but I do speak and engage in many Reform temples, conservative synagogues, and so on and so forth. And I have very close who are Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, and so on and so forth. And the fact is that when we speak about the rabbinate in Israel, the rabbinate in Israel predominantly does not recognize whatsoever other denominations and streams of Judaism. And so I don't need to tell you, but there's a huge amount of frustration from the Reform Jewish side, from the Judaism, in which they're saying to themselves, I don't understand. Why is it that we're expected and asked to step up to support Israel, to demonstrate our support and love of Israel by giving monies, funding, various initiatives, various meetings, board meetings, organizations that we're involved in, when in actuality, the very structure of the Israel does not recognize who we are. And even if they don't necessarily agree with us halachically, in other words, within a Jewish law framework, That doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be, or that there shouldn't be engagement, conversation, dialogue. That is something that is very, very few and far between, and something very difficult, if anything, impossible to find within the system in Israel. And so as a result of that, young people, and by the way, I have to tell you, I'm surprised that it took so long, but the younger generation of a Reform affiliation or of a conservative affiliation decided, you know what? Like, what's in it for us? They don't even recognize us as Jews. So why would I want to be engaged with such an institution? Why would I support a country that's completely subscribed all of, or puts all of its Judaism's eggs into the basket of orthodoxy? And by the way, the rabbinate in Israel today is not only, it's not just Orthodox, it's what we would call ultra-Orthodox or Haredi, or what we would call here classically black hat Judaism. It's something that doesn't relate to us. It's something that's foreign from us. And certainly they see us, i.e. Reform, the way I'll even include myself as a modern Orthodox Jew, they see us as foreign entities. So the more that they view us, so to speak, as foreign entities, or as entities that do not deserve that recognition or engagement, obviously the consequence is going to be dual, and there's not going to be as much engagement as a result. I want you to know that one of the things that I do, one of the organizations that I run, Mishutaf, which means unified place. And in this organization, I started the organization about 9 years ago to demonstrate that there should not be a monopoly, if you may, on Judaism. There should be, Judaism should be inclusive. Judaism should be conversational, inviting, and Judaism should also be secure enough to force our product on anybody. People will subscribe and be interested in Judaism because it is Judaism. And sure enough, I started this organization. I go to many secular kibbutzim, moshavim, many secular pre-military academies, and I give them programming that have to do with Jewish culture, Jewish history, Havanat HaMikra, which is understanding the texts of the Torah, the Bible, and in this way demonstrating that all of us are united and all of us have differences. We can agree to disagree, but we at the same time have many uniting and bonding factors that make us, or that allot us the opportunity to call ourselves Jews. Well, one of the programs that I have is a panel. It's very interesting. I bring together someone like myself from a religious Zionist world, or what you would call here in the modern Orthodox. I have also a Haredi ultra-Orthodox Jew who will sit on that panel. And finally, I have also a secular Israeli. And all three of us sit together. We're all friends. We know one another. And each one purports what their philosophy or understanding of Judaism is. And then there's an opportunity for the people in the kibbutz or the people in the audience to ask questions, much like the venue this evening. When I went to this panel and we set it up, the woman who comes from the ultra-Orthodox world, she was not available. So I had to bring someone else, and I checked him out. And I said, I kind of knew who he was. And I said, you have to understand, you're speaking to a secular audience. There has to be a certain understanding. And even if you propose your ideas, we have to be sensitive to everybody. And he's a nice guy. But in discussing the issue of the Kotel, the Kotel Amarabi on the Temple Mount, he said there a terrible, terrible thing. Because we all know, you all know better than me, the issue with davening or praying on the Temple Mount, that it should be open to all denominations. Reform should be able to pray there with women and men sitting together, and so on and so forth. You're all familiar with it. Well, when that issue came up, he said to me, he didn't say to me, he said to the audience, but very, very inappropriately, he said, the place of the Kotel, of the Western Wall, is a Makom Yehudi. It is a place allotted for Jews, and therefore it is inappropriate to have a mixed service there. Now, this was a terrible thing to say, highly inappropriate and completely off. And the reason why is because he called it a place for Jews. Well, does that imply that Reform congregations who pray mixed women and men together, that they're not Jewish? Of course not. That's utterly ridiculous, and it's completely wrong. And yet his vernacular that he used was so accustomed to excluding other denominations that this is what came out of his mouth naturally. And what I'm trying to say is that it's a problem because the moment that these kind of innuendos are suggested demonstrate exactly what I'm describing. And after a while, when people in other denominations hear Orthodox rabbis, Orthodox representatives in Israel espousing these ideas, they say, why should I engage with Israel? Why would I be interested in what goes on? They're not inclusive, they're not understanding, and they don't recognize me for who I am. By the way, I want to tell you something very interesting. Very often, I'll have Reform congregations or conservative congregations or even secular Israelis. They'll come and they'll say to me, the rabbinate of Israel is this and that. They're terrible. They don't include. And I always tell them, listen, Chevra, I don't think you understand. In actual, the rabbinate in Israel works wonderfully to your advantage. You see, because since the rabbinate in Israel is so ultra-Orthodox and not inclusive, as a result of that, they grow more and more irrelevant in the Israeli scene. If you had an active rabbinate in Israel that was supposed to be representative of Orthodox Judaism and that was more inclusive and demonstrated were tolerant to other denominations, then you'd have a problem. I know it sounds strange, but think about it. The fact that we have a rabbinate that is in charge in Israel that is so removed from the people and so misunderstood, and their agenda has really nothing to do with the popular mass, that actually works to your advantage, and you're given opportunity to voice your opinion. Think about that for a moment. But nonetheless, it certainly encourages disengagement. The second issue that comes up is that we live in a generation, and I want to be very clear here. I am not looking to engage in politics. That's not what this is about. But we have to also recognize the truth. And the truth is that we live in a generation that would coin itself as being more liberal, more liberally. And so what happens is, with that liberal front, Israel is now viewed more as what we would call an occupier. And so when we speak about, for example, settlements on the West Bank, or what people would say behind the Green Line, they're now seen as Israel are occupying those territories. It didn't used to be that way. And as the perception of Israel, so do the opinions regarding Israel as well. The Arabs today, or the Palestinians, are certainly viewed by a large part of the Jewish world as being a persecuted minority, as opposed to, when you look back, 1948, the War of Independence, 1967, the Six-Day War, 1971, the Yom Kippur War. When you look back, the perception of Israel was a David and Goliath. The David was Israel. The Goliath were all of the Arab nations who were more powerful, more aggressive. They were the aggressors, and they were persecuting still, if you may, the Jewish people. Remember, this was not a long time after the Jewish people had experienced the horrible consequences, the catastrophical consequences of the Holocaust. And so there was still a connection between the establishment of the state of Israel and the destruction of the Holocaust of the Jewish nation. And therefore, Israel at large was still viewed as the David with the slingshot who had to take on the Goliath. Today, that perception has changed. And to a large extent, Israel has become a very successful country. You know, I remember when I made Aliyah in 1990, not that long ago, but it is 32 some odd years ago. You know, even then in 1990, the perception was, oh, you're sacrificing, you're going to a country that's a third world, that's destitute, that's needy, that's hungry, and you're making this tremendous sacrifice. Well, today, necessarily the case. Israel is a very functional, economically viable, successful country. And even the prime minister before Bennett, Netanyahu, longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, Netanyahu infused, and it doesn't matter whether you agree with him, don't agree with him, yes, agree with him, like him, that's not the issue. But he definitely infused the Jewish culture and Israel's perception of the Jewish world with a certain confidence, nay, even a certain arrogance. And to a certain extent, he created our own Frankenstein, because Israel no longer is or was perceived as the David. It now is perceived as the Goliath. We are in control. We are the aggressors. We are the occupiers. And as that goes, so does the opinion. And therefore, liberally minded world, Israel is seen as the aggressor. And for that reason, many young people feel that Israel's wrong. They disengage from Israel. Israel is a country that they'd rather not have to do with, or rather not associate themselves with, or some of them are even embarrassed by associating themselves with Israel, the aggressor. Certainly suggestions by the BDS institutions that compare Israel's attitude and approach to the Palestinian situation to an apartheid. These are things which I myself don't agree with, but nonetheless, they're things that are thrown around out there, and as they are, so do the opinions go and the influence of social media. And for that reason, many youngsters from their generation feel disengaged from Israel as a result. Third issue is people are attracted, generally speaking, people are attracted to things that move them or that they can engage in personally. You know, I remember, I'll give you a little, not that anyone needs a tip on this, but I remember someone telling me when I would go out with a girl, they used to say to me, you want to win that girl over, make her speak about herself. Sit there and listen and let her speak about what she does, who she is, her family, what her plans are. She'll fall in love with you in an instant. The moment you open your mouth and speak about who you are, it's going to become a problem. Well, the point is that people like to hear themselves. People like to speak about things that are of personal interest, that they feel they have a personal investment in. And so people today, there are many issues with regards to Israel that people in the United States don't necessarily feel interested in. For example, when we speak about Israel, the main issue in Israel, even today, not as much, but it still is the issue of the army, the issue of security. Whereas the typical American Jew is not thinking about security and not necessarily thinking about an army, thinking more in lines of the economy. So, for example, if we were to speak about what generally allows a prime minister in Israel to win the election, it would be security, or certainly security would be a very serious consideration. What is their approach to the army? What is their approach to military spending? So on and so forth. Whereas an American public, when asked with regards to what exactly is the main factor going to decide who's going to be the president of the United States, the answer is predominantly economy. what's in it for me, and how am I going to make a living and be able to provide for my family? And I'm not belittling that. It's very, very important. It's important on the Israeli scene as well. But the differences, the par between what is my main concern remains there. And for that reason, there is as well disengagement. And I have to say that this is perhaps, in my opinion, the biggest problem. And herein lies a certain analysis. And this is very important. I want to make it clear, in no way do I mean to sound condescending whatsoever. But again, I'm trying to speak the truth, and I'm happy to take questions. This is, again, in my perception, what's going on in the world. The more Jews, or that the Jewish people grow uncomfortable with their Judaism, the more they grow uncomfortable with the Jewish state. In other words, there is a direct connection and affiliation with our being affiliated with Judaism to our being affiliated with the Jewish state. And the way that Judaism goes is the way that it goes as well. So, for example, there was a poll that was conducted 5 years ago in San Francisco, in which they found that 40% of 18 to 34-year-olds who were polled were uncomfortable with their Judaism, not only with the Jewish state, but with their Judaism at large. If they cannot find representation within the ethnicity or religion that is representative of them, then it's very difficult for them to find representation with regards to the country that is representative of that religion or ethnicity as well. And therefore, this, I think, is really the source of the problem. Judaism and the Jewish state go hand in hand. The older Jew from the past generation, more comfortable with their Judaism. They were showing up to synagogue every Shabbat on the Sabbath, or at the very least, they'd show up on Jewish holidays. Or there was the generation when Jewish people would, at the very least, show up for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, or for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But today, there are many young Jews who are not showing up even for that. They're not interested. They're disconcerted. And certainly now, when we live in a time of COVID, when even within, you see it within denominations such as Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy, who would have regular service every Shabbat, every Sabbath. And that itself is becoming dissipated because of people's, the loss of their being enamored with going to the synagogue, or their COVID or whatnot, more isolation, less dialogue, less social interaction, and therefore less social programming. And as a result of that, many of the younger generation are disengaged from their Judaism. The moment they're disengaged from the Judaism, that automatically is going to translate in being disengaged from their country. And so in the Pew survey in 2013, they found that 93% of the generation, i.e. people from 60 and above, define themselves as Jewish through their religion, as opposed to the millennials, who only 68%, I'm sorry, you have the 68%, 32% found that they had no religious identity whatsoever, including eating Manischewitz matzah. So these are things that, as a result of that, it's very hard to an affiliation with the country when there's not necessarily an appeal for affiliation with the religion or with the faith. The Torah tells us, the Bible, and this is taken from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, the Bible says like this. I'll read it in English. You shall observe the entire that I command you today, so that you'll be strong and you will come and possess the land to which you are crossing the Jordan. Now listen carefully to what it says here. It says, you shall observe the commandment that I command you, so that you will come and possess the land. The great commentator, the Ramban, Rabbi Moses ben Nachmanides of the 13th century, that within the context of this verse, there is the directive that we are expected to observe a commandment so that we can inherit the land. Says the Ramban Nachmanides, it is very clear. They go hand in hand. The more that the Jews observe the commandments, the more that they find themselves affiliated with the Bible or the text of the Bible, or understanding and having in what it says in the Bible, the more they will be privy to inherit the land. And the less so, obviously, is the opposite, the antithetical result. And so what we need to do is, excuse me, in my opinion, to move away from what we consider the political and move towards what we call the personal. Israel would need, once again, a personal affiliation for people, something that resonates with them, something that they can relate to. We need to move away from seeing Israel only as a country and to begin to see Israel as a Jewish institution. The more that we do so, the more we are allotted, or the more interest we will certainly build that momentum that we'll have in the country as well. In Brandeis University, we're talking about more than about 20 years ago. So there was, they found that those who were older than 30 years old and above, that those Jews were much more supportive of, as opposed to those who were younger than 30, they found that they were much less engaged. And what we have to do is we have to be able to find ways to engage a younger generation. What speaks to them? What resonates with them? It's important for Israel to address this issue if they want United States of America, American citizens, certainly of the younger generation, if they're interested in having them engage in the country and being, and yes, I will say it, in giving funds to the country, then they have to find ways to relate to this younger generation. And I'll give you a typical example. The last mayor before Leon, the mayor of Jerusalem, was a fellow named Nir Barakat. Nir Barakat is a very, very successful businessman. He's a multimillionaire. And in fact, I think he didn't even take a salary to serve as a mayor of Jerusalem. He did it out of the generosity, the interest, the kindness of his own heart for his Jewish people. And sure enough, when he served as the mayor, he was brilliant, because what he did was he took the city of Jerusalem, which was predominantly viewed by Israelis, secular Israelis, as a religious city that invites only religious activities, but not cultural ones, and he transformed the city into something else. I'll give you an example. My wife has relatives from Tel Aviv, cousins. The last time they visited Jerusalem was 15 years ago. That is absolutely mind-boggling. You're not talking about them living in the Golan or the Golan Heights. It's a 3.5-hour drive, which also will be difficult or hard-pressed to understand. But Tel Aviv is a half an hour away, 40 minutes at best. And yet they were not visiting Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem was seen as a city that is for the religious. It's something that adheres to religious institutions, but does not appeal to the masses. Well, Barakat changed that. And what he did, he said, I'm going to give and offer cultural programming in Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem runs a beer festival, a wine festival. Jerusalem has a light festival. The entire old city is circled with beautiful lights and videos, and you walk through it and you see this art. He had special art exhibits throughout the city. And what he did was he was inviting more Israelis to visit Jerusalem and to witness what it had to offer. Machane Yehuda, the shuk, the marketplace in the middle of Jerusalem, used to be an old run-down place that just was a place that you picked up bargains for fruits and vegetables. Today, it's a bustling place for yuppies. There are beer halls, there's bars, there's restaurants galore, and tremendous cuisine. And the youngsters are visiting again. So what he did was he took and realized that I have to appeal to a younger generation. Exactly that. And this is something that really, in my opinion, has to happen with regards to Israel at large. The Bible tells us a very interesting thing. In the portion in Leviticus, in chapter 25, verse 10, this portion of Leviticus speaks about the various blessings that the Jewish people will have if they follow, obviously, and the consequences if they do not. And the Torah, the Bible says like this: you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be the Jubilee year for you. Each of you shall return to his ancestral heritage, and each shall return to his family. Now, this thing, because what's being described here is not only the return to the land on the Jubilee year, in which we leave the land to itself, we don't work the land, we allow it to produce itself, and we hand it to God. But on that year, the Torah, the Bible says, leave the land and return to your heritage, return to your family. In other words, we are reserving out of every 7 cycle to allocate that year to reflect on the family, to reflect on the heritage. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Shmuel Mohaliver. He lived in the late 1800s. And he explained in his discourse called Chibat Zion, the love of Zion, he said that in order for us to return to our achuzah means your inheritance. That inheritance is referring to a piece of land. That inheritance is referring to our family. Jewish people have to return to their inheritance. That is not something necessarily physical, but something that is an attribute, a characteristic of subscribing to a generation, to a people, to an ethic, to a moral, to a value. That is what we have to be able to return to as well. And I think that this is something important to remember. If we are able to embrace and understand that all of us are part of a family, that all of us are part of an initiative to unite and to work towards the cause of not only Israel, but of Judaism, I think that the face of Israel will change completely. And I'll give you an example of how this exhibits itself. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Aaron. He died a number of years ago. He was a brilliant Torah scholar. He's an Orthodox rabbi. And he had a student of his who left Israel and became a rabbi in an Orthodox congregation in the United States. The student called him up and said, you know, Rabbi, I have a problem. I'm an Orthodox rabbi, and the Reform Temple, as well as the Conservative Synagogue, they want to run a program with me. Orthodox, how can I do such a thing? Now, you and I know, I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't think it was a ridiculous question. I would be setting myself up for failure. But Rabbi Lichtenstein, without pause, asked him, which program are they interested in running? And he said they want to have a joint program for Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. Rabbi Lichtenstein immediately said to him, don't understand. Did the Nazis differentiate between Orthodox, Reform, conservative Jews, unaffiliated Jews, secular Jews, observant Jews? No. To them, every Jew needed to die, needed to be persecuted. Why then are you looking to differentiate between the various denominations on such a type of program? It's ludicrous. Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, said a fascinating thing. We all know he was the chief rabbi of Israel and also a survivor of Bergen-Belsen at the young age of 6. And he said as follows. He said, the Holocaust taught the Jewish people how to die together. The state of Israel has to teach the Jewish people how to live together. But how to live together is much more difficult and challenging than dying together. We should never know. But this ultimately is something that has to happen. There was an article written by a fellow named David Schraub, and the article literally is called as follows. It's called, Guess What? Israel Doesn't Care What American Jews Think. That's what the article's called. And he says that in actuality, Israel would rather engage and accept monies and funding from evangelical Christians. And he says, why is that? Because when they deal with evangelical Christians, they just give the money and they don't express opinions. They don't necessarily dictate policy to Israel in terms of what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to behave. Whereas when you're dealing with Jews, we all know there is another opinion. Well, that might be true, but it's time for us to impress upon our youth, particularly in the United States, that their opinion, their Jewish opinion, does count. It is important. It is part and parcel of our existence as a Jewish populace, as a Jewish nation, and yes, as supporters of a. And so, one of the things that he proposes, this David Schraub, is that we should create something called a Jewish People's Council. Be like an association of Jews from all different denominations or no denomination at all. But people as Jews that could sit together almost like a united nation, right? If you may, sit as one people with emphasis on inviting youngsters to part and to discuss issues that resonate with everyone. So for example, before I started this Zoom, a lovely lady asked Rabbi Boxman, wait a minute, what's going on with the community in Texas that they were taken hostage, right, in Houston, Texas. And the truth is that that's an issue of security. It's an issue of security that affects Jewish institutions. That's something that they can sit down in Israel and discuss. How can we be of service? How can each side be of service to one another? That's something that a Jewish People's Council can engage in. The school systems, education, teaching Hebrew language, teaching about Zionism, teaching about nationalism. How do we incorporate more of those programs, not only, by the way, in the diaspora, but also in Israel? You know how many young people no longer know the premise, the establishment of the Zionist founders of Israel? It's astounding. History has been lost within our concept of education. And so these are things that also can be discussed as one. And finally, certain things such as intermarriage, holy sites in Israel, these different things could be discussed amongst another. And as a result of that engagement and that dialogue, certainly we created a greater rapport and connection, affiliation, and at the very least, respect from one to the other. Young American Jews towards Israel itself. As the famous statement goes, better to argue with than argue about each other. And therefore, I conclude with the following thought, and then I'm happy to take questions, of course. I mentioned to you ago about the Bible that discusses the blessing that the Jewish people will have should they subscribe to the word of God, and God forbid, should they not, the curses that they receive. In the blessings, the Torah, the Bible says, first I'll read in Hebrew, V'cherev lo tavor ba'artzachem, v'natati shalom ba'aretz. Sword, a sword, will not pass through bowels of your land, the confines of your land and your borders, and I will bless your land with peace. And the question is, we all know the authenticity of the Bible. If indeed it is authentic, then we know that nothing is repeated in the words of the Bible. Nothing is superfluous. Well, that blessing is one and the same. On the one hand, it says, a sword will not pass through your land with peace. And then it says, and I will bless you with peace in this land. Is that not one and the same blessing? Same thing. And the answer is no. When the Bible says that a sword will not pass through the heart of your land, that's referring to the enemy without, our external enemies who try to persecute and destroy us as a nation. But then, when it says, I will bless your land with peace, that is talking about the enemy within. We as the Jewish people, we as the various denominations, we in all of our colors and all of our imagination and all of our differences will find peace with one another. We'll learn how to live and how to engage and how to appreciate what each of us bring to the table. That is the ultimate blessing that Israel is blessed with. I hope and pray that not only that day will come soon, for the sake of our ability to engage in that dialogue, to appreciate and accentuate what each of us bring to the table, but also ultimately for our ability to engage and show more interest as a result in our dear land of Israel, the state of Israel as well. I thank you for inviting me this evening. I certainly welcome comments and questions, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Rabbi Boxman.
Thank you. Thank you. I know I speak on behalf of all of us for that inspiring talk. Started out depressing, thinking about all the reasons that we have disengaged, but you ended on a high note with hope for the future. Thank you for that. I want to share a question that was posted in the chat, and then I will open it up. I have a question of my own to add. So if you have something on your mind, feel free after I ask this one. This was asked by Scott Newman. What percent of the rabbinate in Israel doesn't recognize Reform Jewry?
Of the official rabbinate in Israel?
Yeah.
All. There is no representation of Reform Judaism in the rabbinate of Israel, unfortunately. There have even been factions of Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, such as myself, other people like a Rabbi Shlomo Riskin or a Rabbi David Stav, and I'm not comparing myself to them, but the fact is that they are Orthodox rabbis and they do try to engage with conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism in Israel, but officially, the rabbinate of Israel has no recognition whatsoever.
And why is that still a thing?
Why is that still the case, you're asking?
Yes.
I mean, unfortunately,
you spoke lovingly about how Hitler didn't recognize divisions among the Jewish people. And yet, the Israel that I was 6 years old when Israel was born. My father served in the Haganah. I'll stop there. He served with Weitzman and Dayan and Ben Gurion in his platoon. So I have that love in me. But I'm going to post on the in the chat the sentence that I've been struggling with while I've been listening. But when the young Jews see that their rabbi is disrespected in Israel, when women are disrespected at the wall, when they see what I posted in the chat, they don't have the context that I do. My grandson doesn't know. Allow me to finish, please. My grandson doesn't know that his great-grandfather served in the Haganah. He doesn't know, doesn't have the pride that I have in my father having done that. This is a big problem. And you talk about disaffected youth. You cannot re-engage Jewish youth in high school and college while their rabbis are disrespected, while women are disrespected, while Palestinians are evicted from the homes they took in 1948 when they left in Karen. I'll shut up.
I'm going to ask you to pause for a minute. You're repeating my lecture. That's what I said. I agree with you. I'm not arguing with you. I agree that it's a problem, and I understand that you take a personal offense to it, and I agree with your personal offense. Do I have the power, authority to be able to make that change immediately? No, but beginning to be able to identify the problem is the beginning of finding hopefully a solution. I do believe there begins to be more Orthodox, not many, but more Orthodox rabbis in Israel who are a little more open-minded and who are starting to think a little differently and realizing that they do have to engage and that they do have to respect. So, yeah, I mean, what you're saying, is exactly what I said in my lecture. I agree.
Yeah, I want to just add something also. So a lot of my own congregants don't know this, but I actually was married in Israel by the rabbinate.
Oh, wow.
Yep. As a Reform woman rabbi, I married an Israeli, and it was important to his family. So we were married by the rabbinate in Israel. And thanks to an organization, and I'm blanking, you probably know what it is. It's an organization.
Zohar.
Thank you. Zohar. Which helps.
Which I belong to, by the way. Yeah.
Amazing. Which is a maybe you can better explain, I think, a sect of the rabbinate, a breakoff of the rabbinate in some way that provides more of a welcoming approach, so much so that the rabbi who married us, who was a member of the rabbinate, Orthodox rabbi, referred to me as rabbi. He was respectful to me. He allowed my father, who's a Reform rabbi, to be part of the ceremony and do the Birkat Kohanim. And I actually had a very positive experience in Israel, and I've had many positive experiences. I don't believe that that I am disrespected in Israel. I know that there are those, same here in the United States, that look down on me and don't respect me. But that's not what defines my relationship to Israel. Now, again, I know I'm not your average millennial. I know I'm different in that way, but there are different avenues, and I do see progress in the way that Reform Jews and Reform rabbis are viewed in Israel.
Well, I let me say, Rabbi, that first of all, it's very interesting what you just said. And second of all, I'm very, very happy to hear what you just said. I belong to Zohar, and it's interesting that you bring them up, because you should know at one point, Zohar, that organization that married you and your husband, was not officially recognized by the rabbinate in Israel. But today it is. Today it is. And they do not have to report back to the rabbinate if you're married. Which, by the way, any couple that I marry off, I tell them to go through them in order to spare them any hardships or any uncomfortable situations, formalities that they might not necessarily make sense to them, or might be an infringement of their privacy. And I tell them go through Zohar, and today Zohar is accepted by the rabbinate in Israel. In addition, there's another thing that has changed a little bit in the rabbinate. That is, you can get married with any rabbi that you want from wherever you want in Israel. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be that if you lived in Jerusalem, you have to get married through the Jerusalem municipality. That's not the case anymore. And so what happens is that also, now many of you are probably sitting there and saying like, wow, big deal. It is a big deal. You know, it shows a certain movement, a certain a certain lucrative understanding. They are trying to enable and to be more understanding to people's needs. So that slowly but surely is, there are things that are happening.
So unless there's another question in the group, I do want to share something that came to mind as you were speaking. I'm thinking back to my own Jewish studies as a teenager and learning about Aliyot to Israel, the early Aliyot, specifically from Russia. And my teacher explaining that people decided to move to Israel because of certain push factors and pull factors. And the push factors, the main one was anti-Semitism and, horrible treatment of Jews in Russia. And obviously the pull factors were all the benefits of living in a country of Jews and all this. I'm thinking now, especially with Colleyville on my mind, if a benefit of anti-Semitism, if there ever could be a benefit, is a push factor of pushing people back towards a love of Israel, feeling a sense of pride in their Judaism, of having a connection. We all share, in this sense, a common enemy, and I don't know, it was a moment of hope that maybe this could help bring some of our people back.
Yeah, I mean, I look, in the end of the day, it's unfortunate if that's what has to be the case, but certainly anti-Semitism, it should naturally gravitate people towards their Jewish state, towards identifying with their Jewish state, towards understanding that ultimately their place of salvation, where they always can call home, is Israel. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't want that to be the only reason. I mean, it's like
agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's like in Israel. When do you see real unity? All the various factions in Israel: ultra-Orthodox Judaism, unaffiliated secular Israelis, modern Orthodox. Where do you see it? When there's war. Unfortunately, war is something that unifies us. And that's why I brought down what Rabbi Lau was saying, that Israel has to teach us how to live together, not how to die together. And it shouldn't be anti-Semitism that should unite us. It should be a preempt. It should be before. If there's anti-Semitism, then we have to unite as well. But it would be so much more meaningful. God forbid it should never be anti-Semitism, but if there is, it would be that much more meaningful if we were already unified ahead of time. I saw a fascinating insight into the Talmud. The Talmud says that anyone, it's a strange statement, but anyone who lives in the diaspora is as not having a God. It's a very strange statement. I'm not going to go into the details. It sounds rather strong, and it is. But one of the interpretations I saw, because there are many interpretations, because when one hears that statement, they say, whoa, what does that mean? One of the interpretations is, it doesn't say that they don't have a God. It says they're perceived as if they don't have a God. By whom? And this commentary says it's by the other nations. They say, I don't get it. It's your state. It belongs to your people. Why are you here? You should be over there. And now I'm not preaching that everyone should come to Israel. I'm not one of those rah-rah, and I get it. Many people cannot live in Israel, and it does not allow them the opportunity. And I completely get that, including members of my family. But the point is that certainly we should always, all Jews should be able to come to a day where they aspire to look to the land of Israel as a homeland. And that is something that should be embedded in us and should be part and parcel of our culture.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I want to open up to any other questions in the group. I did see that Scott posted another one. What suggestions do you have about how we should teach Israel to our students in Sunday school?
I'm sure you do it already, by the way. So I would need, I would need to know, what you do. But I think what's very important, Scott, is that when you teach about Israel to students, it shouldn't just be it has to be experiential. There's no question about it. That's what talks to kids today. But at the same time, it should be also informative. In other words, we should be teaching them where Israel appears in the Bible and why. Excuse me, what is the context that is used regarding Israel in the Bible? What does the Bible say about returning to Israel, the Jewish people affiliating with Israel? And also, even more than that, what did our founding fathers of Zionism say? What were they purporting? Why was it so important? How does Israel deal with these issues? I think much of these issues need to be explained to our youngsters, so that it's not just, about eating hummus and falafel. There's substance to it. It's a serious, and that's what gets their minds working. And that's what begs them to say, help us find a solution, help us discuss, be a part of that conversation.
And I would add, especially what's very important I've noticed especially with our older students, is being willing to listen to what their concerns are. What are they? Why? Let them explain why they don't have the relationship, and engage them. That it's not we need to shut the door. God forbid they say that they, don't love Israel, but rather allow them to share and be open. I think that's the first step in opening the door for a relationship.
Absolutely.
So before we conclude, I do want to share something else, and I'm sure, Rabbi Hammer, you're familiar with them. I was visiting Israel this past summer and had the opportunity to engage with an organization called Vibe Israel. They're fascinating. It's a group of young people that are dealing with this exact issue of engaging the disengaged, and they're doing it through what they call rebranding Israel. And they're changing basically the marketing of Israel in order to engage the millennials, the young people, the teens, and they're really doing a fantastic job. If anyone's interested, I did spend quite a lot of time with them, and may be able to even invite them to share a little more about how they're doing what they're doing, because it did bring me up.
Interesting. Thank you. Interesting. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thanks to all you folks out there. And again, please save me a spot in Naples. I'm coming. I love Florida. It's beautiful. I love the west coast of Florida. And I look forward to visiting with all of you in the near, and hopefully seeing you in Israel as well.
God willing. Thank you very much, Rabbi Hammer. Have a good rest of your visit in Florida. And we look forward to seeing you in person in the near future. Shalom.
Thank you.